Welcome everyone to our Scholars in the Square lecture for this evening. Hello to those of you joining us online tonight and in the future on YouTube. My name is Rachel Brown and I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at UVic. Now, as a reminder, tonight's program will unfold as follows. First, our speaker, Suad Ahmed, will offer a 20-minute public presentation, and then she will engage in the 20-minute period of conversation with Youssef Benzoui, a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Montreal, who is currently a visiting graduate research fellow at the CSRS and was our sixth speaker just a couple of weeks ago. Youssef's PhD research is an ethnographic study of Muslim men in Montreal, and his research interests more broadly revolve around Islam, gender, secularism, and Islamophobia in Quebec. Now, after Suad and Youssef talk for 20 minutes, a conversation that I think will be incredibly rich as they both offer diverse perspectives on two Muslim communities in different parts of Canada, I'll chair a 20-minute open discussion period. Now, our speaker for this evening is Suad Ahmed. Suad is a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education at York University and a visiting graduate student fellow with us at the CSRS. Her research focuses on the identity formation of Somali Muslim youth in Toronto. And with a background in community-based research, she employs Youth Participatory Action Research with artistic research methods like photo voice to explore the emotional and social dimensions of identity making among Somali youth. Among many other research and community engagements, Suad served as a research fellow and a research coordinator with the Coastal Research Education and Advocacy Network, where she leads projects on anti-racism in education and the belonging experiences of racialized youth. Suad's work examines the ways that members of marginalized communities often need to negotiate complicated and varying sites of belonging in their everyday lives, often in and against the backdrop of systems that are not built with them in mind. Often this invisibilizes and also emphasizes experiences of exclusion. And this is something we often see at work in other communities, especially Indigenous. And so I would like to take a moment to acknowledge and respect the Lekwungen, Songhees, Wasepsim, and Esquimalt peoples on whose territory the university stands, and the Lekwungen and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. And now please join me in welcoming Suad.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Rachel, for the kind introduction and that acknowledgement. I'd also like to thank the Center for Religion and Society for creating space for this conversation today. I'd like to start with a disclaimer that I am fasting, so I'm in the last 2 hours of my fast today, so apologies in advance for any low energy on my part, but I will try my best. So today I'll be sharing some emerging insights from my research through our eyes on the social and emotional lives of Somali Muslim youth. This project explores how English-speaking Somali Muslim youth in Toronto describe and make sense of who they are and who they are becoming within the social world they navigate. Because I have a background in the sociology of education, schools and school life are an important part of the story, but I'm also interested in what we can call the broader geographies of their everyday lives. So their movements across neighborhoods, across mosques, community spaces, and the different environments they move through and ascribe meaning to. I also attend closely to their spiritual lives and to the ways their faith shapes how they interpret their experiences and understand themselves. So before moving further, I also want to briefly acknowledge my own relationship to this work. So I come into this project not only as a researcher, but as someone who grew up within the Somali community in Toronto and shares many of the same social roles that my participants navigate. So I attended the same mosques many of the youth described going to. I too moved through many of the communal spaces they referenced, and I was familiar with the neighborhoods they described as the first places where they cultivated friendship and community. And because of this, my positionality inevitably shapes how I approach this research, and that my experiences allow me to recognize the many forms of belonging and out-of-placeness that participants surfaced in their reflections. Yet at the same time, my proximity also meant that I needed to approach this research with an extra amount of care that allowed for me to remain attentive to the ways participants' stories exceeded my own experiences, while also allowing their voices to guide how their worlds are interpreted and represented. And this is very in line with the ethos of community-based research. So alongside this personal connection are broader observations that first sparked my curiosity about this research. So growing up within the Somali community, I became increasingly aware of how Somali youth and the Somali community more broadly are often located within public discourse through deficit-oriented narratives. So in media and policy conversations, Somali communities are frequently framed through discussions of crime or risk or educational underachievement. And while these discussions sometimes emerge from real social concerns, they also shape how Somali youth and the broader Somali community come to be understood within public life. So over time, I became unsettled by how frequently Somali communities appeared in public discourse almost exclusively through stories of crisis or difficulty. And scholars such as Eve Tuck and Catherine McKittrick remind us to be cautious about research and discourses in general that focus solely on harm or damage, as these approaches can often reproduce deficit narratives that reduce entire communities to stories of suffering. Instead, Tuck invites scholars to move toward what she calls a desire-based framework, one that attends not only to struggle, but also to people's aspirations, their relationships, sources of strength, and orientations toward maturity. Essentially stories of complexity, which is the very dynamic of experience that is often denied to racialized people. So taking this invitation seriously, my project adopts a community-engaged approach that centers Somali youth as interpreters of their own lives. Rather than approaching them through pre-existing narratives, the study focuses on how they make sense of their experiences and the social, communal, and spiritual worlds that sustain them. With this in mind, the kind of central question guiding this presentation today is, how does Somali Muslim youth in Toronto interpret and navigate their everyday lives across the social roles they inhabit? And more specifically, I aim to explore how does racism, including anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim racism, or anti-Muslim hatred, and forms of misrecognition shape their experience in public life? What kinds of spaces generate different emotional experiences for them? And how do Islamic ways of understanding the world shape how these youth interpret and respond to these experiences? In terms of theoretical framework, my project is informed by work in Black cultural studies, critical Muslim studies, and post-colonial psychoanalysis and affect theory. These traditions really help me to understand how race, religion, and emotion shape everyday life. From Black cultural studies, I draw on work that examines how anti-Blackness structures the conditions of everyday life for my participants. I use critical Muslim studies to help me understand how Muslim identity has been racialized and politicized in very particular ways within the West. And post-colonial psychoanalysis studies that I read alongside affect theory helps me to explore how particular emotions circulate socially and attach themselves to particular bodies. I pay attention to the emotions my participants surface in their reflections, emotions such as fear, pride, sadness, joy, ambivalence, peace, and how these feelings arise directly in response to broader structural forces such as anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim hatred, as well as how they arise within the community's relationships and spiritual frameworks that sustain these youth. In this way, I'm interested in how affect circulates across the various spaces they inhabit, and what kind of movement of feeling, and what this kind of movement of feeling can reveal about the conditions that youth encounter within their everyday. And one of perhaps the most important interpretive lenses that my project has adopted emerged from my participants themselves. Again and again, youth drew on Islamic ways of understanding the world when reflecting on their experiences. For many of my participants, this meant situating their everyday experiences of exclusion and misrecognition or difficulty through a spiritual framework that placed their own experiences within a much larger cosmology. And hopefully we'll talk about that at the end. In terms of methodology, this study used Youth Participatory Action Research, often referred to as YPAR, which treats participants not just as research subjects, but as collaborators in the research process. So in this sense, this approach attempts to align with a desire-based framework that actively centered young people's own interpretations of their lives, including the issues they themselves identified as important. The study included 8 Somali students between the ages of 14 and 18, who at the time of the study were enrolled in secondary schools across Toronto. And throughout this project, participants took part in several interconnected research activities. The first involved an open-ended focus group where youth were invited to discuss the issues that they felt were most important to their everyday lives. And it was through these early conversations that a number of key themes began to emerge, including, the everyday forms of misrecognition they encountered, their very particular feelings of belongingness and out-of-placeness, and the central role that Islam played in shaping how they understood their lives. Alongside this conversation, youth also engaged in visual storytelling through photo voice, where they were invited to take photographs of the people, places, and spaces they felt shaped their identities, including places where they felt they belonged and where they felt excluded. Following this, participants took part in a photo elicitation narrative-style interview where we sat together and discussed the photographs they created, which then enabled them to kind of guide the interpretation of the photos while also articulating memories and emotions that might have otherwise remained inaccessible. Taken together, these multimodal methods allowed for my participants to reflect on their lives in multiple ways, right? Through conversation, through storytelling, and finally through visual expression. And now to move on to some of the findings. So at this very early stage of analysis, my findings suggest that Somali Muslim youth navigate life across three interconnected domains. So they move through institutional spaces, particularly schools and workplaces, where their racialized visibility can sometimes lead to experiences of misrecognition and emotional injury. They also move through community spaces where the sense of collective life fosters their joy and belongingness. And spiritual life, right, where youth describe finding emotional grounding within Islamic concepts such as tawhid. To kind of zero in on the first finding, so one of the first themes that emerged from my study relates to what youth described as their everyday experiences of social injury, which we can regard as moments in which the subject encounters subtle or overt forms of disavowal, what we can regard as rejection or dismissal within ordinary social interactions. Three forms of misrecognition appeared most consistently across their reflections. So the first was anti-Muslim prejudice, wherein many youth, particularly the young girls who wore the hijab, described everyday encounters in public space where they felt hostility was directed toward them, specifically in connection with their visibly being Muslim. And second, anti-Black racism. And so all my participants described experiences of heightened surveillance and suspicion, moments where they felt they were being watched more closely or were interpreted through assumptions of wrongdoing. And the third was ethnic stigma, right? So both Somali girls and boys described encountering stereotypes about the Somali community and felt that this shaped how teachers or peers or others sometimes interacted with them. More often than not, these experiences were not always dramatic or overt, but appeared in more subtle ways that communicated to that young person that they were out of place. And over time, these moments shaped how my participants moved through the world. That is, how they anticipated encounters, how they interpreted them, and how they come to understand their place within the spaces they move through. And now to move to specific examples of this. So in conversation about the various forms of misrecognition in their everyday lives, the young women in the study, all of whom wore hijab, consistently foregrounded experiences of gendered Islamophobia, a form of prejudice that targets Muslim women through visible markers of faith, such as their hijab. For my participants, I learned that gendered Islamophobia is often imagined through spectacularized acts of violence. So a hijab being pulled off, or like a go back to where you came from, yelled from a moving car. And while these events do happen, my participants often describe Islamophobia as a slow accumulation of effective impressions drawn in from everyday encounters. So a rude question, a look of disgust, or the deliberate act of being ignored. And over time, these small gestures communicated the persistent message to them that they were outsiders. In this sense, gendered experiences of Islamophobia is not this peripheral concern, but was an active structure and condition of their everyday lives. I argue that gendered Islamophobia contributed to their hypervisibility within public spaces, and where at times their hijabs became surfaces upon which Islamophobic affect was projected upon. And to look now at this example that I provided. So when I asked participants to recall moments where they felt particularly visible as Muslims, Shahad described one encounter at her workplace. So she said, I worked at the CNE for about 18 days in 2023 at a game booth. One day, a woman came up with her child and looked at the prizes. When I asked if she wanted to play, she gave me the nastiest look and turned to my coworker instead. My coworker wasn't Muslim, and I remember wondering if it was my hijab that bothered her. What was striking about Shahad's account for me is that the injury did not emerge through, again, a dramatic act of violence. Instead, it unfolded through a more subtle interaction, right? A look of disgust followed by a turning away. And scholars who study Islamophobia as an affective field remind us that anti-Muslim sentiment often operates through these everyday affective encounters, where particular emotions are projected onto Muslim bodies, which then shapes how that Muslim is positioned within public space. In their study of everyday Islamophobia, Nadia Ali and Arich only suggest that these encounters are often organized not through fear, which is a feeling we commonly associate with Islamophobia, but through the affective register of disgust, right? So disgust toward the Muslim other. So drawing on Sarah Ahmed's work on affect, disgust operates through a particular movement of proximity and recoil. So one must come close enough to register the other and then reject them. So as Ahmed describes, this unfolds through a quick sequence of seeing, registering, and churning away, a dynamic clearly visible in Shahad's encounter. Hence, for Shahad, it was her hijab that appeared to be the catalyst for this entire interaction. Reflecting on how she felt after that moment, she explains, I was shocked, right? So growing up around many Muslims, I wasn't used to being treated differently because of my religion. What surprised me most was that it happened in Canada, where people always talk about Canada being diverse and accepting. In that moment, it felt like that image of Canada just broke apart. So her first focusing on shock matters deeply because it signals a kind of sort of this loss of innocence, right? The collapse of a sustaining fantasy of Canada as this inherently kind of uncomplicated multicultural haven. In that moment, the narrative of Canada as inherently welcoming kind of begins to fracture for her. And in reflecting on this encounter, she explains, afterwards, I felt really sad. It changed my perspective on life because before that, I had only heard about these experiences online or in the media. You don't expect it to happen to you. Even though this interaction was upsetting, I still have to say, alhamdulillah, praise be to God, it wasn't worse. People have acid thrown at them or have their hijabs pulled off. So I remind myself that this is just a dirty look and not something more violent. So alhamdulillah for that. Again, what's interesting here is that even within Shahad's own interpretation of this encounter, Islamophobia appears most legible through spectacularized acts of violence, a framing that is very much shaped by post 9/11 narratives. Yet in everyday life, Islamophobia more often unfolds through these kinds of subtle encounters that then leaves one with this lingering sense of discomfort. So by referencing incidents such as hijabs being pulled off or acid attacks, Shahad situates her own experience within a broader hierarchy of anti-Muslim hostility, and in doing so positions her encounter as relatively mild. And finally, what's striking in Shahad's reflection is the affect that she ends off with, which is that of sadness. So rather than naming anger or fear or shame, she returns to sadness as the emotional register through which she remembers this encounter. And this would not be lost on any post-colonial psychoanalytic scholar, as this kind of sadness can be understood through the concept of racial melancholia, which refers to the lingering psychic weight that accompanies experiences of exclusion, no matter how subtle. And so while the young women of this study often encounter discomfort through the hypervisibility of their hijabs, the male participants described a somewhat different pattern of misrecognition. So male participants more frequently described experiences shaped by anti-Black racism and ethnic stigma, where they found that suspicion from the outside world became a dominant effective register of their everyday lives. So several of the boys explained that they often felt as though their presence was already being interpreted before they had ever spoken. So one participant says, even when I do nothing wrong, the moment I walk into a room, I feel like someone is already questioning me in their head. Even though I'm not really a bad guy, they think, oh, he's Somali, he's a criminal. Another participant described how the sense of surveillance appeared specifically within the classroom. So he says, it feels like the teacher's always watching me, like if anything happens in class, they look at me first. Participants also recalled moments where the suspicion was explicitly articulated by authority figures. So one youth described that there was one time where a group was playing together and one kid who wasn't Somali got hurt. The principal told him not to hang around bad kids, meaning us, even though we didn't do anything. Taken together, these encounters produce, obviously, an effective environment of surveillance, and it is within this environment that boys describe developing this kind of self-monitoring, carefully managing how they appear, how they act, and how they move through public space in order to avoid being suspicious. These experiences reflect what Lisa Farley describes as the ongoing invention of Blackness, where Black subjects also become surfaces upon which projections of both fear and suspicion are cast upon, making it so that Black boys are denied the innocence typically associated with childhood, and in place of that are positioned within narratives of deviance. So to wrap up, these accounts reveal that while Somali youth navigate both anti-Black racism and anti-Muslim prejudice, the way these forces become visible in their everyday lives are highly gendered. So for the young women in this study, Islamophobia appeared through the hypervisibility of their hijabs. And for the boys of my study, anti-Black racialization became the primary lens through which their bodies were encountered. Now to just move to the next image. So you'll notice first thing with this photograph that it's flipped upside down. Everyone thought this was a mistake, but the participant intentionally presented the image in this way to illustrate what misrecognition feels like. So she says for her that misrecognition occurs when the external gaze attempts to read you, but never quite captures you as you are. And her caption is really interesting because she talks about, where these external spaces can produce misrecognition. She writes that home is one of the places where she feels most herself as a Muslim, meaning where she exists without explanation. So what this image kind of began to reveal for me is this interesting insight that while many of the youth encounter misrecognition in public life, they also spoke about the importance of other spaces where different emotional experiences became possible for them. And it is those spaces that we'll turn to now. So when asked to photograph places where they felt most themselves, youth described a collection of spaces where very different emotional experiences became possible for them. These included communal spaces, right? Organized sporting environments, the mosque, places where they felt they did not feel watched or misread or required to explain who they are. And it is within these spaces where their bodies could relax, where they spoke about feeling the sense of togetherness. And in many ways, these spaces functioned as what Bell Hooks describes as home place, sites where communities cultivate care, despite whatever may go on in the outside world. At the same time, these spaces reflect forms of institutional completeness, where the Somali community in Toronto has cultivated really strong kind of social and cultural environments that allow for its members to kind of sustain their own sense of belonging within the community by having their own spaces. And then finally, a really striking insight from this study came from our participant who described belonging in a way that challenges many assumptions of, at least in educational research. They explained that I feel like I belong everywhere because belonging happens inside of you. If you know who you are and who Allah is, you can belong everywhere. This statement stayed with me for many reasons, because much of the educational literature treats belonging as something institutions can either grant or withhold, something produced through school climate or DEI policies. But what this participant surfaces is something really different entirely, right? So rather than locating belongingness within institutions, belonging is something internal, grounded in faith. This was also reflected in the photograph here where the participant's prayer mat. They explain that in moments of prayer, especially in times of vulnerability, that's when they felt the most connected to God and where they felt, most themselves as a Muslim. In this sense, their sense of self was not entirely dependent on institutional recognition, but drew upon kind of Islamic ways of knowing as a source of emotional grounding as they move through different social worlds. Taken together, these findings suggest that the lives of Somali Muslim youth unfold across multiple affected terrains, across institutions, across communal spaces, and finally within spiritual life. Thank you.
So now we'll have about 20 minutes of conversation between Yusuf and Suad.
Well, thank you for your presentation. It was great, and I find it very interesting for different reasons. But I have my ones in mind. But I really appreciate how this idea that you showed how there's like a soul combination of experiences that build up into Islamophobia, which is very interesting because I think in general we have this idea of Islamophobia, as you just said, is exceptional, something that may be visible, but sometimes it's not necessarily the case. So really, I think this is something interesting to delve deeper into, and also because of your methodology, and yeah, there's a white bar methodology that you were talking about, and I was wondering when you went through that. I think you also mentioned your positionality a little bit. So we're just curious to know a little bit more about those challenges that came up, during your research. I mean, considering that you're a Muslim person working on Muslim people, how does it go? Yeah, if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I situated myself as a researcher, but also somebody who grew up within the Somali community. And so a lot of the spaces that they talked about, a lot of the experiences they had, I kind of shared them and immediately sort of felt as though I understood where they were coming from. And that was helpful in a lot of ways because I think it sort of produced in them a feeling of trust, like they felt I understood where they were coming from. And I think they also believed in the project as well. Challenges though were that, I think when you kind of move through the same worlds as your participants, that can kind of limit your own, I think maybe the fullness of curiosity that maybe an outsider would have. So to kind of sort of temper that, I would ask a lot of questions, right? And so moments where in the focus groups, I felt that participants kind of, shared something and I felt I understood what they were talking about. But I sort of wanted them to open up more about it. I would resurface it in the photo elicitation interview that I had with them. And so in that way, I tried my best to be as curious and as open and to not close, I guess, the conversation by assuming that I understood where they were coming from always. And so that, I think, was sort of the double bind of being like an insider, but also like trying to be an outsider and failing sometimes.
Tell me about it.
Yeah.
And yeah, and to bounce back on that, I was also, I mean, the question is maybe obvious, but like, considering that, how does it affect your data then? Because, I mean, obviously, let's say if a white person has worked on Somali, on the Somali youth that you have worked with,
Yeah.
how, I mean, probably the results will have been different, or the data guide will have been different. So, yeah, could you, what are your insights on?
Yeah. I mean, I've had this conversation so many times where I worried that I think my own positionality sort of influenced the data in some way. Or maybe me presenting as religious, for example, allowed them to speak more about the role of religion in their life. Or me being Somali and like for whatever reason, like aspects of my identity maybe meant that they felt sort of comfortable sharing aspects of whatever they deemed important in that moment. And I kind of what was the question you were saying? Lost the track.
Yeah, the question of, it was more like, what do you, like, let's say if it had been like a white person.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
how do you expect, like, would it have been different or the same, or?
I did send sort of I worried that would happen. Like that was a real kind of fear that I had. And so I sent the transcripts back to the participants to kind of ask them if what they said and how I understood it was kind of, you know, if it was right. And so I did that as like an extra precaution kind of. And that's kind of a best practice within community-based research to send your transcripts back to the participants and give them time to kind of like even like take something out, right? They may have said something and they meant it, but in that moment maybe they want to backtrack and they can remove it. And so I provided that option, right, to be able to kind of see the research process as fluid and always organic and moving kind of, and not this like thing that's fixed in place. You said this and it's going in my dissertation. You can't take it back, but not as not in that way, but just it's a very fluid and open process. And I tried to kind of have that in place so they felt comfortable, but also that the data was actually accurate, you know, to their own experiences.
And also the photo voice, that's a very interesting process. Like, yeah, I'm just curious, could you like explain a little bit more?
Yeah, so so the reason that so I'm a arts-based methods girly. For my master's, I asked them to do drawings, and so I wanted to keep kind of the spirit of the arts-based method. And so for this time around, I thought photo voice would be a good option. And so with the photos, I think especially with the flipped one that we saw, it allows you to kind of surface these emotions or these kind of sentiments that you can't really capture in language sometimes. When I saw the flipped photo, I kind of understood what she meant with misrecognition, that I feel like if she were to explain it to me in words, I wouldn't quite grasp. And so I think with photos, they provide, you know, just an extra layer of depth, right? And so that was the reason that I included them. And the process of it sort of, it unfolded through like 10 days. And so the prompts I created from the focus groups. So whatever they kind of talked about in the focus groups and whatever was a major theme coming up, I centered the prompts for the photo voice based on the focus groups. So Muslimness was something that came up. So I said, talk to me about, you know, where you feel most yourself as a Muslim, right? And what does Muslimness even mean to you? Take photo of that. You know, aspects of like Somali life came up. So like, where do you feel the most Somali? What does being Somali mean to you? And so belonging and exclusion was also a theme. So take a picture of where you feel the most sense of belongingness, take a picture where you feel the most excluded. And so these kind of became like, yeah, the focus of the prompts, right? Based off of what they shared with me. Yeah, and it was, I created a group and I would send a prompt every day and they would sort of, I'd expect that they took a photo and at the end of the process, they kind of shared all the photos with me. And then that became the basis for the photo elicitation interviews that I did with them. That were all like one-on-one with each of them. And I asked them to kind of walk me through all of the photos, why they took the photo, why they took it in the specific way that they did, you know, what they're trying to communicate with the photo and to kind of tie it in with the captions that they also shared. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a great idea because usually with transcripts, when you read them, you don't see the effects.
Yeah.
You don't see the emotion, you just like see a text.
Yeah.
And it doesn't necessarily convey the complexity of what was happening.
Absolutely.
But I feel like it complements like the transcripts and also during the presentation talking about the photos, you also mentioned sometimes that people took pictures of like mosques and spaces of belonging. So I was just wondering, yeah, if you could like develop more about like these spaces, how they look like, and how it ties to. I think you mentioned this idea of I think it's really interesting concept, the Islamic ways of knowing.
Yeah,
Is there like a link between these two, like the space and the Islamic ways of knowing?
yeah. That's a good question. So I think what I ended up at first I was kind of obsessed with the mosque. So I was like, they're taking they took several photos of a very particular mosque in Toronto. So I thought like, okay, this like there's something there for sure. But when I went back into the data, I kind of saw that it was actually a collection of spaces that they talked about, right? It was the mosque, but it was also like a very particular like community center that they gather in. It's also like, you know, some kids mentioned sports, right? Like basketball and one plays football. So it was like a collection of different spaces that I felt that they sort of frequented, right? And where they derived a sense of belongingness from. The mosque was a space that came up, especially in relation to Muslim identity, right? So for the prompt related to where do you feel the most yourself as a Muslim, a lot of them said this very particular mosque in Toronto is where I feel most myself as a Muslim. I feel accepted in my religious identity. I feel like I can grow in my religious identity within that space. Yeah, and so it was a collection of spaces, one of which was the mosque. But the mosque was a space that, you know, a lot of them actually, you know, connected with and frequented.
And do you think there's like a link to that could be made with this idea of Islamic ways of knowing?
Mm-hmm. So, yeah.
Maybe not.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering.
Yeah, so I was gonna maybe make it a bigger part of the presentation, just the idea of I feel like Tawheed is something that came up a lot. So Tawheed is kind of one of the core messages of Islam, right? Kind of the unicity of God and just the oneness of God. And I found that whenever they were talking about sort of resistance, right? So resistance to this recognition or resistance to exclusion or like resistance to like the social order, they really pulled on God. Like they pulled on oneness, right? And so I thought that was interesting, and I thought that there's definitely something there for like Tawheed as this kind of like critical consciousness, right? Or this kind of a kind of maybe disobedience, right, to the different social orders that are in play. And it also kind of shows too that like what I think is there maybe is that I don't know if I can say this here, but within like these kinds of social orders, there are kind of like metaphysical kind of injuries that happen, right, within the capitalist social order, like the social one or the economic. So I think with Tawheed, and when you're trying to get at something spiritually, it's almost like a metaphysical repair, kind of, against these like the metaphysical injuries, right, that these social orders can have. I need to learn more about this. That's something that I'm thinking.
Yeah, probably just something because, like, definitely, like for these, like for the way you're talking about these people, to hate is something that is it's like oneness. It's
Yeah.
This goes beyond the individual. It's
Yeah.
like it's broader than that.
Mhm.
It's more, I just said, like metaphysical and also spiritual.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And talking about theory, I was also wondering if you could like develop more about the framework you use because you mentioned Black cultural studies, critical Muslim studies, and also post-colonial psychoanalysis and effects. So maybe it's like a lot of big words. Maybe it could like
Yeah. Yeah.
But like and like I know them, but like some people maybe don't know them, so could maybe
Yeah.
just develop more about them, explain them.
Yeah, so Black cultural studies really gives you the vocab to understand how anti-Blackness actually operates as a force in everyday life. And so particularly experiences around like surveillance and misrecognition, suspicion, like it provides like a real kind of theoretical backing to these forces. And to kind of illuminate how like racialization shapes the way Somali youth are kind of read and positioned, and a lot of that has to do with anti-Blackness. And so at the same time, critical Muslim studies offers kind of tools to understand how Islamophobia operates within the everyday. And specifically, you know, it doesn't just stop there. It also centers kind of these Islamic and like Muslim ways of knowing and epistemology so that we can kind of take seriously sort of the kind of intellectual frameworks that Muslims have, right, in responding to the world. And so I think those are kind of the two that I use. And were there other ones?
I think you also mentioned post-colonial psychoanalysis.
So post-colonial psychoanalysis is, you know, I have a love-hate relationship with post-colonial psychoanalysis, but it's very, so it provides a lot of, and the reason it's post-colonial because it's post-Freudian, right? And a lot of, I think, scholars have, you know, gripes with Freud and how he didn't imagine any of these youth when he was developing his own theories. So post-colonial scholars really take into account the Black psyche, right? The Black unconscious, and the ways that structural forces can shape the Black psyche. And so the concepts of like racial melancholia and like racial ambivalence, sort of the persisting kind of grief and sadness that comes with navigating the world as a racialized subject, they give vocab to those kinds of experiences, right? And reading it along affect. So affect theory is more, I think, rooted in like the sociological tradition. And so it looks at how emotions are not these kind of individualized experiences, but they have a social quality, meaning they bounce between people, and structures and spaces. And so it really is, it kind of problematizes the individualized kind of views that we have on emotion, and kind of situates it within like a sociological kind of frame. Yeah, I think that's it.
You said something.
Yeah.
Yeah, so why did you choose like this specific frameworks?
Yeah, so
Because I mean, you could have like chosen, or I don't know, like I'm thinking about critical race theory, or
so I think for critical race theory, I think Black cultural studies adopts kind of tenets of critical race theory, but I think, if I'm not mistaken, but I think with critical race theory, there's kind of a critique that's been made, I think, by mostly Indigenous scholars, that critical race theory itself has a very secularized view of race, and so it makes very strong separations between like race and cosmology, and I think for the youth of my study, being Black is being Muslim, and being Muslim is being Black. These things are very entangled within each other and are not these kind of separate intersections that are kind of discrete from each other, but are very much entangled. And I think within critical race theory, there's a real separation that's kind of made. And so I don't know that sort of, that it doesn't always account for cosmology. And I think that's a critique that some scholars make. With Black cultural studies, my understanding is that it uses kind of themes from critical race theory, though I'm not sure exactly where the active departure is. Why Black cultural studies versus critical race theory, I'm not sure, but yeah.
And also we were having a discussion before today, and you were talking about like institutionality, which is, I mean, it's very present within critical race theory, and how in a way it doesn't necessarily maybe we could like develop more, but like I think you're really into something like how intersectionality, this is the point of regarding religion and spirituality in general.
Yeah, I think within sort of intersectional like analyses, first of all, it was a really beautiful. Is Farouk in the room?
Yeah,
She made a beautiful kind of remark to me that I don't think people sort of narrate their lives in an intersectional way, right? No one does that. Or some people do maybe, but I don't think the youth of the study did. But we adopt these kinds of intersectional approaches to parse out their experiences, right? To understand how their race kind of relates to their religion and relates to their, ethnic background and stuff. And we use these kinds of frameworks to help ourselves as researchers, but rarely ever do we use or people speak about themselves in that kind of way, which is interesting too, because what my whole gripe with intersectionality is that I think with religion, it's not, I think for the kids of my study, Islam didn't really feel like an intersection, right? Islam was more of like a framework for seeing life, or I don't know that it could be reduced to like an identity marker. And so, I don't think it could be reduced to just that. Yeah.
And I find this interesting because it reminds me, I'm not especially of that tool, but I know that's not, in one of his books, he talks about how we use science as a framework to understand religion.
Yeah.
And that for him, it doesn't work at all because there's two different worldviews, or like two different systems. And I think what you're saying is along those lines too. Like it's not like to see Islam and like identity something separated. It's not really work.
Yeah. Especially for I think for people who view it as a kind of framework for life, I don't know that it be reduced to an identity.
Awesome, thanks. So we can open to the room now, and those on Zoom, if you have questions, you can put them into the chat and we'll ask them into the room. So yeah, we'll start with Rory.
Thank you, Suad. That was great. I really like this idea of like effective terrain, and it got me thinking about a mosque as an effective terrain. And one thing that really struck me was you mentioned that there was a particular mosque that they felt a positive affect or like a homeness. And so I wonder if you could speak a bit more about that particular mosque, you know, in terms of what factors there do you think fostered that positive effective terrain? Because, you know, different mosques can have very different, let's say, subcultural vibes, aesthetics, emotional tones. So yeah, if you could speak a bit more about that particular mosque.
So from what I remember, a lot of the youth described that they remember growing up within that mosque. So from a very young age, they attended that mosque, and that was kind of their go-to like home mosque. And it was also a very Somali mosque as well, which is a very important piece. It was a mosque that was run by the Somali community, and it was pretty diverse, I want to say, in that members that were non-Somalis also frequented the mosque. But it was it had that ethnocultural kind of element to it. It's a place where they had sort of like different programming, right? Different youth programming. So they'd have like weekly, halaqas, weekly gatherings. And the youth would attend these gatherings. And it was a place where they could meet their friends, right? There was also like a restaurant nearby, so they'd like go there and grab food and come back. And so it was kind of like a social spot on Fridays. And so a lot of them, and I also treated it that way too when I attended when I was probably around their age. And so it had that kind of communal aspect where like you made friends in that space, you met so-and-so in that space. Like it was a place where the community would kind of frequent together, right? And it had the mosque vibe, but also a community center sort of vibe, sort of feel to it.
Yeah, please.
So first I want to just make a comment on one of the first question that you asked, actually, Yusuf, around the data and how does Saad's positionality impact the data. So I think it's just really important. This is a comment, not a question. But we rarely question the positionality of how non-Muslim researchers' presence with Muslim subjects impacts their data. We never really critically examine how authentic is that data, how accurate is their interpretation of that data. And so I think it's really important to consider that your positionality, as you mentioned, they trusted you. They see you as an insider. There's an inherent sense of you relate to them, which I think is super important. Just as a person of color in general, this is not just with Muslims, but we often say, oh, how does the insider research, how do their biases impact the data? And we very rarely have more than a surface level discussion when it comes to outsiders within a particular community. So thank you for asking that question, because I think it's really important to highlight that aspect of Saad's work and the work of generally POC researchers. The other question that I had, and this is related to the intersectionality and the flaw in certain theories, especially like critical race theory, intersectionality in general, and its blind spot when it comes to spirituality. So how does Western academia's entrenched secularism and often a distrust of confessional Muslims in particular, how does that impact the way that research on religious identity regarding Muslims is received and interpreted and either uplifted or suppressed?
Wow. Good question. That's a really good question. Can you repeat the question? Actually, it's the question.
So how does Western secularism in academia impact the way that the data or the research is interpreted, the way that it's either uplifted or suppressed?
Right. Okay. I think it's such a good question, and I have to sit with that. But I think a lot of as researchers, there's this kind of implicit sort of move to kind of secularize your own research, right? And I think, I think Western academia, and I don't want to make wide sweeping claims, but I think sometimes it can treat religious identity as a sort of private thing or sort of this very singular aspect of identity where, and that's what the gripe was actually with my own participants, that like, I was just like, okay, I don't think it's just an identity marker, I was struggling with the language of like, how do they conceptualize their Islam in relation to everyday life? And the word framework came up, and maybe I'll find a better word in like a couple of months' time, but framework was kind of the best word. It was kind of this sort of way of seeing life, and not sort of this thing that they did sometimes, or that, had, was 1/3 of their experience. It was actually, it was bigger, but it was sort of broader kind of thing that overarched everything, but also wasn't that big of a deal too. And so framework was the best word that I could come up with. But yeah, I didn't like the sort of the reducing religion to an identity marker that kind of happens within academia.
I'm wondering, Suad, too, like, we have had conversations a little bit about this, if I'm also understanding the question well, and just even when we talked about this presentation and your kind of hesitation around, do I include point 3,
Oh, yeah.
right? Do I include
Yes.
the actual Islamic ways of knowing
Yeah.
as a finding and as a valid finding? And so even that sort of hesitation, I think, reveals how sometimes the system, the fact that you felt like this was not something that maybe you could bring, but then in a certain space and in a certain theoretical framework, like someone who's coming from religious studies or the Center for Studying Religion and Society says, absolutely, you should bring that in, but how are we going to talk about it?
Yeah.
And so I think it depends also under which umbrella you're operating under the Western Academy and under which conception of secularism and secularization and how that plays out in data. And also what a lot of folks like yourself and others are trying to do to kind of make more space for some of those conversations, I think is really important. But that just made me remember like 2 days ago in my office and you being like, can I even say this in the room?
Or should I?
Yeah.
Will I have enough time to kind of unpack it too?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's true. Yeah.
Yeah. And I would just like to say that, at least in religious studies, outsider researchers get questioned way more than insider
That's good
researchers.
to know. That's good to know.
Constantly questioned, constantly. Just so there are fields, again, within which I think you can see that at work. So, yeah. There's a question online, and then we'll come back into the room.
There are several. So Laura says, through our eyes seems very important as it points to the fact that racism, exclusionism, and misrecognition often come from a lack of understanding. And understanding is often found when reaching in and learning others' perspectives. Did any of the participants express examples where non-racialized Canadians showed willingness to reach in and understand their perspective?
That's a really good question. Thank you. Participants definitely surfaced like their relationship with, teachers that they felt really supported their journey, right? Their own friends, right, that were non-Somali, non-racialized people that they, had built relationships with. And I think one of the boys mentioned that he had a friend who would come over to his house and spend Ramadan with him, and he was not Somali or Muslim or racialized. So they definitely referenced relationships with non-racialized people as being valuable, right? And using it also as like that person's like sort of teaching them about their ethnic background or the things that they value. And yeah, they definitely have those kinds of relationships for sure. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, Kikila.
You said you don't like intersections, so I'll find a way to ask the question. What do you think the effective impact is of adding like kind of the passive anti-feminism that exists in Canadian society to it? Like, would you say like then women are identified first as Muslim, then as racialized versus like, let's say men or males seem to then be seen more as like Black bodies. What made me think about this was you're invoking the proximity and withdrawal of disgust.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So for my participants, I after doing like a cursory like kind of glance at the research, their hijabs were kind of the site, right, where they felt they experienced the strongest social injury, right? So their hijab was kind of where they felt, others kind of either judged them, right, like non-Muslims judged them, or where they felt a sense of like visibility within public life. So really feeling their hijab when they're around non-Muslims. And so the hijab was one of the major themes, right, that kind of came up, and the way in which they felt othered, right, within non-Muslim spaces. But I also want to surface that even within Muslim spaces, they kind of talked about how even like the particular way that you wear your hijab, right, could mean that you're maybe more religious than you feel, right? And so having this kind of double movement of thinking, oh, I don't want to come across as too religious, which means I'm judgmental. And others can't really share, my non-Muslim friends can't tell me their stories, versus like, I love my hijab and I, will always, sticking basically by the hijab and loving it, but also feeling these uncomfortable feelings within Muslim spaces and non-Muslim spaces. And so the hijab was a huge theme that came up with regards to like hypervisibility. Yeah.
Yeah, Paul?
Me?
Yeah.
But Paige has a question though. Oh, could you scooch back a little bit to, I think it's Shahad's, her sadness, so.
Yeah.
When I saw that, I was thinking one of the dimensions of intersectionality, which you're not really toying with very much here, perhaps you do in your dissertation, is the question of age.
Yeah.
So these are kids,
Yeah.
right? And this is kids. I mean,
Very young.
yeah, they're young. They're emerging.
To you, they're kids.
They're emerging into the world,
Yes.
and this is the time when people all have their hearts broken.
Oh,
I remember being roughly her age when I discovered that, your bosses will try to pay you as little as possible. Because my aunt was going to a union meeting, and I said, "What's a union meeting?" And my uncle said, "Well, all of your bosses for the rest of your life will try to pay you as little as humanly possible." It's like, what? So that was my heartbreak around capitalism. And then I began to see the whole world differently.
right.
So I'm just saying this is a time frame when all of these people are emerging into the world where the innocence of their 10-year-old lives, when they had peers and they hung out at the mosque, is being broken. Their hearts are being broken by seeing the larger world. Because in some sense, that's a story about relief. Her heart is broken, she's sad, but she's now seeing herself on a bigger map where it's way worse other places. And so she says, "Oh, that's a bummer. Canada's like this too, but it's way worse somewhere else. There's no acid being thrown in my face." So, I mean, I'm just wondering if, so you're focusing on the sadness, but I'm focusing on thinking about, she's coming of age,
Yeah.
and her heart is being broken about the world she's been born into, and placed into. And this is kind of a generational element that's occurring, for her. So I just wonder if the sort of developmental psychology component is a feature of it. It must be. Because that would be a significant fact of these biographies.
Okay, yeah, that's a really, thank you for that. I think it's something that definitely will come up in when I kind of begin writing. But it's something that really sort of stayed with me, kind of the sadness piece, and also her trying to almost buffer past the experience by putting it in view of all the other terrible things that happen on a daily basis.
Yeah.
But we were having this conversation that I think within like this kind of post 9/11 world, we kind of think about these kinds of Islamophobic attacks as being these really crazy things, right? Like hijabs being pulled off or thrown into the subway. And it kind of excludes these like day-to-day experiences of like being made to feel uncomfortable because of your hijab, for example, or someone ignoring you because of your hijab. These things happen on an everyday kind of basis. And so these kinds of large acts of violence will almost, blur those experiences that happen way more often, which I think is the piece to kind of highlight here. But for sure, like the developmental thing is interesting though.
Like, I'm not trying to defend.
No, of course.
I've got lots of negative things to say about Canada, but this seems like a variant of the coming of age story where someone realizes that the world is not okay. When people learn about the Holocaust and when they learn about, whatever, and they think, what? I live in this world? No one told me. I was playing with my buddies, and all of a sudden I realize I'm part of a terrible fallen world. And in some sense, this is her moment of seeing that. But this is kind of across the board. You could interview white hockey players in Etobicoke, and you find some kind of story of like, oh my, the conscientious ones. The other ones are not so much. The conscientious ones have moments where they say, Gaza? What's happening in Gaza? And then then their innocence is gone. This moment of heartbreak and disenchantment is sort of endemic to this age group, it seems to me.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Paige, and then yeah.
I'm curious, well, first of all, how many young women did you interview versus young men? Was it?
Yeah, so it was even, so it was 4 girls and 4 boys.
And I'm curious, you know, it seems to me, like I think about when I was that age and where I felt a sense of belonging, I think was different than maybe where boys found it. And so did you find a sort of gendered pattern that, well, the girls tended more to say they felt belonging here? And was there a pattern that was more than just being a girl, but being a Muslim girl or a Muslim young man?
And sort of the third spaces that they frequent.
Yeah. I mean, whether that's home, whether that's the
Mhm.
football field, whether that's whatever.
I think that's something I'd have to look into, just because I didn't make that, I didn't look for that. But that's interesting, and I'll probably get back to you on that.
Thank you, Suad. This was very nuanced and I really enjoyed your talk, your presentation. I was thinking about places of refusal of belonging as a space of belonging. So for example, I think it's true to say that a lot of young people refused to accept the normative story about Gaza, you know, and the encampment was one such place of belonging based on a refusal to belong. And did you find that sort of nuance? I know that a lot of young Muslim people have been very much activated by this refusal to belong to, you know, not in my name, to Canadian, to the Canadian state. Don't do this in my name because I don't agree in their relationship with Israel. But there may be other places, and I wondered if you found such things.
So places where they
Refuse to belong as a space of belonging. Or even just not just refusing to belong, because isn't there a kind of a bias that all young people seek places of belonging? But they actually are quite active in refusing places of belonging.
Yes.
Like white supremacist places. They refuse, right?
That is such an interesting question. Thank you for that. I can't come up with anything right now, but I'd have to think about it. Just because they did surface kind of these kinds of tensions, like sort of with regards to I remember one taking a photo of like an Islamic relief booth and kind of talking about the situation in Gaza in the caption, and sort of like centering like political activism as being something important to them. But in terms of refusing places, that's really interesting. Yeah, I have to think about that, but thank you for that.
All right, we'll have one last question from online.
Okay.
Good one.
There are lots of good ones. Well, I'll pass them on to you afterwards. So Catherine says, I noticed that your key effective terrains, institutions, communal spaces, and spiritual life did not include friendships and peer groups. Were these really unimportant? And if so, why?
No, it's definitely, I wasn't able to include it within the presentation, but it'll come up for sure in the dissertation. I think in the chapter that I'm probably going to start working on, like infrastructures of belonging, a lot of them talked about like their friend group, right? Having a really strong friend group as being the thing that was, you know, their source of joy, right? And within life, and having a strong like Muslim friend group, right? That kind of helped to remind each other to pray on time or to, you know, do X, Y, and Z thing. And so they definitely talked about friendship quite a bit and how, yeah, just how that was a cornerstone of their sense of belonging for sure. And the role of friendship. Yeah, they definitely.
We just like get our next lecture slide out. Go through. So we have a busy week next week, so I'm going to draw your attention to 2 slides. First, on Tuesday, we have our Harold Coward India Research Fellow, Shubham Arora, who's in the room, giving a talk on sexual pleasure as thought, erotics in pre-modern South Asia. So if you want to think about erotics and the Kama Sutra, please come out for that, because that'll be excellent. It is on Tuesday from 10:30 to 11:30 in the Fraser Building. And then next Thursday, we are not in our normal SITS kind of format or location. We will be in David Turpin for our distinguished lecture in Islam with Zulfikar Hirji, and he will be speaking about hidden heritage, decorated Qurans from coastal East Africa. So please join us for that. And also to be noted that Zulfikar will also be here for the MyCon conference, which is happening next Saturday, not the one 2 days from now, but in a week, which you would all be welcome to attend as well. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Suad, for